Hey, what's up guys? I'm Ryan from ExtremeTerrain, and today I'm here with a SkyJacker 2 to 2.5 inch dual rate long travel suspension lift kit with M95 shocks fitting your 2018 and up 4-door JL. It's for the off-roading enthusiast that is looking for an affordable lift kit that's not only going to gain them some additional ground clearance, but maximum travel. This is perfect for the weekend warrior that is looking for a quality kit that's going to handle all of that trail abuse that they're going to put their Jeep through. This kit is going to get you the height that you're looking for with great on and off-road manners, and it allows you to fit up to a 35-inch tire. Now, this kit comes complete with brand new coil springs, shocks, sway bar links, and even bump stops, giving you some added peace of mind that those larger tires are not going to come in contact with your fenders. Now, this kit swaps out easily with the factory suspension, so there's no drilling or modification required, and comes complete with everything that you'll need to get your Jeep back and up on the road hitting those trails. This kit is reasonably priced on the site considering what you're getting with this kit, and at just around $680, I think this is a great option to go with. As far as install goes, I am going to give this a very strong 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter, as I recommend mechanical expertise and possibly professional installation. Now, I expect this kit to take about 4 hours to install, and I would recommend grabbing a friend. With that being said, let's hop into the install. Tools required for this install: a pry bar, mechanics gloves, 3/8 drive ratchet, 1/4 inch drive ratchet, a razor blade, a marker or a crayon, a stick magnet, a pry tool, flathead screwdriver, wire cutters, pliers, an adjustable wrench, a hammer, standard and metric socket set, a 5/16 Allen key, 7/32 Allen, 6mm Allen, 7mm Allen, standard and metric wrench set, 3/8 drive extensions, 1/4 inch drive extension, 1/2 inch drive extension, 1/2 inch drive impact, 1/4 inch drive ratchet, 3/8 drive impact, and if you choose to go that route, a ratchet strap. So the first thing we're going to do for this install is put our Jeep up on the lift so we can remove our wheels and tires. Now, if you don't have access to a lift, you can jack your axles up and support them with jack stands. So next we're going to use a 1/2 inch drive impact and 22mm socket to remove these factory lug nuts. So now we have the Jeep up in the air, the first thing we're going to do is take off this plastic splash shield. Now this is held with a series of push pins along the bottom of the bumper here, and there's actually 2 screws on the back side, 1 on each side. So we're going to start with these screws. We're going to use an 8mm socket to get those out. Next, we're going to use a flathead screwdriver to take out the 8 push pins in the front. So you're just going to pry up on the center of these and stick the flathead underneath and pry that out of the hole. So next, we're going to keep a hand on it while we get this last one out. And we can pull this shield off. So after you get that splash shield off, the next thing we're going to do is remove this metal plate. Now this metal plate has 2 bolts in it. We're going to use a 16mm socket to take those out. Once you get those bolts out, you want to smack it up in the air and it'll come off. Once we got all that stuff out of the way, the next thing we're going to do is support our axle with our pole jacks. And since I have this yellow plate on the floor, I'm going to put my pole jack under my differential. So now we have our axle supported, the next thing we're going to do is disconnect our track bar. Now we're going to unbolt it where it bolts to the frame on the driver's side. We're going to use a 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench. So after you get the track bar out, the next thing we're going to do is disconnect our drag link. This is just going to allow our axle to drop further, and we're not going to mess this tie rod up. So you're going to have a 21mm nut up there. We're going to use a 21mm wrench to take that nut off, and then we're going to break that free. So once you get that nut loose, you want to get it all the way off, and then we're going to put it back on a few threads so we can crack that free. So there's a couple ways that you can do this. One way is to use a pickle fork, but that's going to mess up the boot. So if you plan on replacing this boot, you can use a pickle fork. What I'm going to do is take two hammers. I'm going to place one on one side, and I'm going to smack the other side with another hammer. Once you get that out, we're going to finish unthreading this nut, and then we'll drop our drag link down. And then just so you don't lose the nut, put it back on the drag link. So next we're going to start removing our end links. Now we're going to use an 18mm deep socket and another 18mm socket or a wrench to get these out. Then we're going to do the other lower bolt on the passenger side so we can swing that sway bar down. So since there's nothing to hold to on the back side, we're going to use an 18mm wrench and a 6mm Allen key to hold this stud still. We'll do the same thing for the other side. So the next thing we're going to do is take out our shock. We're going to use an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket, and we're going to start with that top bolt. So we need to get to this bolt up here at the top. So what I'm going to do is just pull this away a little bit and then sneak underneath of it with a socket, and then we'll take that bolt out. You can also remove your fender liner, but I do not want to do that. So I just took a knife and trimmed a little bit of this away, so once we get this bolt completely loose, we'll be able to pull it out. Next we'll do the bottom of the shock. Next we're going to place a hand on the shock, pull that bolt out so we can remove the shock from the vehicle. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm just going to cut this little section out so I can get an impact and a socket in there to remove that bolt. It's pretty easy to do, and you don't need to trim much. So next we're going to disconnect our brake line brackets where they meet our lower control arm. We'll use a 15mm socket just to make sure we don't rip any lines when we're lowering the axle down. So we're going to do the same thing for the other side. And if you lose things all the time like I do, you can just pull that bracket off and put that nut right back on. So next we have to disconnect our axle disconnect. So you're gonna have a plug right here. There's gonna be a little clear tab. We need to pry that tab out, and then that's gonna be our release. So you're gonna pry this little white tab out. Once you get that out, it's only gonna come out a little bit. Once you get that out, you're gonna press down on that, and that's gonna release this. So once we get that, we need to free it from the top of this control arm. You're gonna have two spots that we need to free up. First is on the back side of the housing. So we're just gonna get in there, pry this out. Then we need to free it up from the upper control arm. So once again, we're just gonna pry this out. And that way when we lower the axle, we're not gonna risk ripping this line. So the last thing we need to do before we lower our axle is to remove our front drive shaft. Now the reason we're gonna remove our front drive shaft is we don't wanna overextend that CV joint back there and mess it up. So what we're gonna do is mark our drive shaft and our flange with a marker or a crayon. And that way when we put it back on, we'll know exactly where it was and put it in the same position. After we do that, we're gonna use a 15mm socket or wrench to get all four of these bolts out. Before we get that last one out, we want to get a bungee or some sort of zip tie so we can hang this thing up in the air. So there's a couple spots up here. Just going to pick a good spot, hang the bungee cord, and that way when we get this thing off, it won't swing down and kill us. So get that last bolt out, slide this back and up. So over here on the driver's side, just below the upper control arm, you're going to have the axial vent tube. This is the last thing we have to disconnect before we lower the axle down. So we're just going to pinch that with a pair of pliers, slide this tube off. Now that we have everything disconnected, the next thing we're going to do is lower the axle down. Now even though we have everything disconnected, you want to make sure that you don't stretch or break any lines. Just pay attention to all that stuff. We're going to lift the springs up off of the spring perch and then down and out of the Jeep. Then we'll do the same thing with the other side. So we finally got the front disassembled, which actually wasn't that bad considering it's a brand new Jeep. Before we get this new kit installed, I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about what this kit comes with, what it's going to do for your Jeep, and how it compares to your stock suspension. Now this kit comes with dual rate coils. The first thing I want to talk about is the coils. Now these coils have two separate rates. You have at the top a tightly wound set, and this set is actually going to fully compress at ride height. That's going to stay dormant and compressed until you're on the trail and you're really flexing that suspension. The lower set of coils is what's going to give you your ride height. This set of coils is going to give you your ride manners, your road quality, and that's what's going to take all of the abuse, whether you're driving on the street or hitting those trails for the majority of the ride. Now the top set of coils, like I said, is going to kick in at maximum articulation. So when you're fully flexed, this coil set is going to decompress and it's going to expand. This is going to keep your wheel planted on the ground, giving you that extra little bit of traction, and it's also going to keep that spring seated from falling out or shifting in the spring bucket, unlike your standard coil with just your standard rate. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the shocks. Now, these are SkyJacker's M95 shocks, and they are long travel shocks. These are high pressure nitrogen filled shocks. So they're going to be a little stiffer on the road, but they're really going to shine off-road. You're going to get minimal fade to lag, unlike a hydraulic shock. Now these have an internal floating piston with a 46mm bore, and one of the nice things about these is they actually have an internal stop. This internal stop is going to keep you from over compressing those and ruining the shock. These have a titanium ring with a Kevlar seal, so it's going to keep all that dirt and dust out, and they have a hardened shaft that's chrome plated. It's going to resist scoring and gouging and keeping that seal intact. These come with heavy duty bushings, so they're going to handle all of that abuse and last for a long time. Now, of course, we are pushing the axle away from the Jeep, so we're going to need longer sway bar links. Well, this kit comes with brand new sway bar links for the front and rear, which is a nice thing, and it's going to level out that sway bar. So the main purpose of a lift kit, of course, is ground clearance, but we want to add larger tires. Now, the nice thing about this kit is it comes with bump stops for both the front and rear. It comes with 2-inch bump stops that's going to allow you to run up to a 35-inch tire. Now, what the bump stops do is they limit the travel of the axle. They're going to stop the axle from coming up when it reaches a certain point, and they're going to keep that tire from contacting the fender. Now, we do have to do some assembly as far as our sway bar links and shocks go. With that being said, let's show you how this gets installed and what it looks like on the Jeep. So the next thing we're going to do is install our spring. Now we do need to bolt these circular bump stops to our axle, which is relatively easy to do. However, we need to put these inside of the spring because once we get that spring in, we're not going to be able to fit these in. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. All right, so you're going to need to drop your axle pretty far to get these springs in. However, we're going to start with the top, sliding it over our upper bump stop, and then we're going to feed this other bump stop up into here and slide it up onto our spring perch. Once you get that in there, you want to make sure that this spring sits in this little stop. And we're going to bolt our bump stop on. So with the kit, you're going to have these 2 long Allen head bolts. You have 2 flat washers and 2 nylon lock nuts. So what we're going to do is just reach through the spring, drop that bolt down. On the bottom, it's going to get a flat washer and a nylon lock nut. Now, this is a bit of a tight space in there, and it's going to be a little bit tough to get this on. I'm actually going to use a magnet to hold all that stuff up in there while I try to get this started. So if you don't have a magnet on a stick or really small hands, you can actually take this bracket on the backside off. There's a bolt here with a 10mm. That'll give you a little more room. So we're going to tighten this up using a 7/32 Allen and a 9/16 wrench. And we'll do the same thing for the other side. Making sure to seat that coil in the top spring bucket And we're gonna insert our bump stop, and we're gonna push this up and over. And once again, we want this to sit in the spring stop. Then we can bolt our bump stop. So following SkyJacker's instructions, the next thing we're gonna do is raise up our axle, just so we can compress those springs a little bit and get our drive shaft back in. And you wanna make sure that these springs seat properly in the top and in the bottom coil buckets. You also wanna make sure if you're doing this on a lift that you don't push your Jeep up off of the lift. So like I said, the next thing we're gonna do is reinstall this factory drive shaft. So you're gonna take that bungee off, we're gonna line up those marks, and we're gonna reinstall those 4 bolts that we removed. We use a 15mm to run those in. You wanna put a little bit of blue Loctite on those just so we can secure those. So after you get all of those bolts installed, the next thing we're gonna do is torque them to 89 foot-pounds. So you'll need a torque wrench, 15mm socket, and actually I'm gonna use a pry bar to hold this drive shaft in place while we torque each bolt. So what I'm doing on the back side is I'm just gonna stick the pry bar underneath the bolt head that's sticking out, and then I'm gonna hold that still while I torque these down. So once you get one, we're gonna spin it around, and we'll do another one. So the next thing we're gonna do is reinstall our drag link. We're gonna reuse that factory nut and use a 21mm wrench. So we're gonna push that back up through the pitman arm, reinstall that factory nut, and then we'll tighten it up. So if you have trouble keeping this tie rod still while you're getting this nut on, you can use a 7mm Allen key to hold that stud still while we tighten the nut up. So at this point in time, we're just gonna reconnect a few things. We have our vent tube, 4-wheel drive actuator, and our brake lines. We're gonna start with that vent tube. So we're just gonna take our pair of pliers, squeeze this clamp together, slide the tube on, and then release. So first, we're gonna plug this back into the upper control arm. And we're gonna take our plug that back in. Make sure to lock that white locking tab. And then since I broke this one over here, just gonna take a small zip tie and zip tie to that, through that hole just so it doesn't get in the way at all. And then next we're gonna reinstall our brake lines on our lower control arm. So we're just gonna press that bracket on there, reinstall that factory nut, tighten it up with a 15mm socket. So since our brake lines and our ABS line is a little tight after the added height of the springs, we're gonna take this bracket on the lower control arm and just bend it up in the air a little bit. That's gonna free our lines up a little bit. So we're almost ready to install our front shocks, however, there is some assembly required. We have bushings and sleeves that we need to press into these. Now you're gonna have 2 sets of shocks. One shock is going to have a longer body and the other one's going to have a shorter body. The shorter body shocks are going to be for the front. Those are the ones that we're going to assemble first. So the top of the shock, we're going to mount these with the body down. The top of the shock is going to get a larger diameter bushing with a larger hole. This is because it's going to fit a longer, thicker golden sleeve. So the first thing we're going to do is take some WD-40 and just spray it on the inside of this. Then we're going to take our new bushing, starting with the top one that has a larger hole, and we're going to press that in. Then we're going to take this gold longer sleeve, we're going to insert that through there, and press that sleeve in. Then we want to slide this over so we can center it on the gold sleeve. So we're going to do the same thing for the bottom. We're going to start off by spraying it with some WD-40, and then we're going to press another bushing in. These are just regular bushings, they don't have a larger diameter. After we do that, we're going to take a smaller sleeve, and we're going to press that in. So we're going to do the same thing for the other shock, starting with the top and using that larger bushing. So before we get this shock installed, we have these black spacers that we're going to install on the ends. And we're going to start with the top, and we're going to reuse that factory bolt. And we're going to use an 18mm to tighten that back up. So next we're going to line up this lower hole, and we're going to reinstall that factory bolt. Once we get that together, we'll use an 18mm socket and wrench to tighten that up. We're going to do the same thing for the other side. Installing those polyurethane spacers. Put that top bolt back in. So the last thing from the kit that we need to assemble and install is our sway bar links. They're going to have two lengths of sway bar links. The front ones are going to be shorter, so we're going to start with those. While we're here at our table with our vise, we're going to assemble the rear sway bar links and get our shocks assembled, so all that stuff's ready to go when we're ready to install it. So these are going to get the standard size bushings and the standard size sleeves that are included with the kit. So we're going to do that same thing. First thing we're going to do is spray with WD-40. This is just going to allow the bushings to slip in there a little easier. And we're going to press these, wiggle them so we can get that bushing to center, then we'll get our sleeves installed. So we have all of our links assembled. The next thing we're going to do is just get these rear shocks assembled. So we're going to start with the tops. And remember, those are going to get bushings with a larger diameter hole in the middle. So I'm going to press our bushings in there, and we're going to install these larger sleeves. So the next thing we're going to do is install our new front sway bar link. Now, SkyJacker gives you brand new hardware for the top. We're going to reuse that factory bolt for the bottom. So we're going to start with the top. So we're going to make sure that the curve faces inward. We're going to use our hex head bolt that they provide us with a flat washer. This is going to go through, and then on the other side, we're going to do a flat washer and a nylon lock nut. Then we'll get the bottom installed and we'll tighten everything up. So like I said, we're going to reuse the factory hardware for the passenger side. And remember, the passenger side has that tab nut. So we're going to line these holes up, insert the bolt, get that all together. So for the top, we're going to use a 19mm wrench and socket. For the bottom, we're going to use an 18mm socket, tighten that up. So we're going to do the same thing for the other side, starting with the top. So we do have one more thing to do on the front, and that is to reinstall the front track bar. We're going to wait until the end when we can get our wheels and tires on. That way we can set the Jeep on the ground and use our steering wheel to help us line that hole up. So what I'm going to do right now is pull the pole jacks, and then we'll get started with the disassembly of the rear. So the first thing we're going to do in the rear is support our axle with pole jacks. After that, we're going to work on getting those factory sway bar links out. So we're going to start with this bottom bolt here. I'm going to use an 18mm socket on an extension and an 18mm wrench. So for the top, we're going to use that same 18mm wrench, but we're going to use a 6mm Allen key to hold that still. Then we'll do the same thing on the other side. So the next thing we're going to do is disconnect our track bar where it meets the axle. We're going to use a 21mm wrench and a 21mm socket to get that bolt out. So next thing we're gonna do is get these rear shocks out. Now to access the top of the shock, we need to remove this plastic cover back here. This cover is gonna have 3 screws in it. We're gonna use an 8mm socket to get those out. Once you get that cover off, you're gonna see the bolt up here. We're gonna use an 18mm ratchet to get that off. So after you get the top undone, the next thing we're gonna do is get this bottom bolt out. The bottom bolt's gonna be the same 18mm, so we're gonna use an 18mm wrench and a socket. Before we get that bolt out, you wanna place a hand on this just so the shock doesn't fall. Then we're gonna do the same thing for the other side. The next thing we need to do is free up our brake line and ABS. So we're gonna remove the bolt out of this bracket here on the axle using a 13mm socket. So one of the last things that we need to disconnect before we lower this axle down is our breather vent tube. So we're gonna use a pair of pliers just to squeeze this clamp and pull that off. Once you have that off, we're gonna lower our axle down. So we're gonna lower this down until we have our coil springs free, and then we're gonna pull those out of the Jeep. We're gonna do the same thing for the other side. You're gonna make sure that you keep this factory isolated. So we're gonna lay that right there. So one thing to note about the rear springs is they are side specific. Now your fronts are not side specific, however the rear are. You're gonna have a part number on each spring, and you're gonna have an R at the end for your passenger side, and the driver's side is gonna have an L. So make sure that when you install them, that you get them in on the right side. So once you get your axle to drop down far enough, you're ready to install your springs. Now, if you do have some trouble getting that axle low enough, you may need to disconnect your e-brake cables. There's gonna be a couple tabs that you'll need to disconnect that, and then you'll have to unhook it from your brake assembly. We have our axle down far enough, so we're gonna install these springs. Now, you wanna make sure that you have this upper isolator in there when you go to put these new springs in, and then the bottom seats properly on the spring perch. And we'll do the same thing for the other side. So now we have the coil springs in, the next thing we're gonna do is raise this axle back up. Now the top isolator actually has a stop in it, so you wanna make sure that you clock that properly with the top of that spring. We're gonna raise the axle up, just put some tension on the springs, and then we'll move on to the next step. And we wanna make sure that the top of these seat properly up in that coil spring bucket. So next thing we're gonna install is our rear bump stops. Now these are gonna have 2 holes on the bottom. These holes are gonna face the axle because we're gonna bolt it to it. Now this is gonna be offset. You want this offset to face towards the rear of the Jeep. That way it's gonna make full contact with the bump stop. Now we have brand new hardware from SkyJacker. You're gonna have these gold bolts. Each bolt is gonna get a flat washer, and then it's gonna go through the bracket into the axle, and then it's gonna get another flat washer and a nylon lock nut. So we're gonna install those now. So we're gonna do the same thing on the rear hole. After we get all that hardware installed, we're gonna use a 1/2-inch wrench and another 1/2-inch wrench. We'll do the same thing for the other side. So next we're gonna do is install our rear shocks. Now we're gonna reuse our factory hardware for both the top and the bottom. We're gonna start with the top. Now the top's gonna get these polyurethane spacers, so we're just gonna slip those on and we'll get that bolt installed. So we're just gonna wiggle that up into that mount until that hole lines up, and we're gonna pass our bolt through, get that started, then we'll tighten it up with an 18mm. Next we're going to lower our axle down just to get that hole to line up. Reinstall that factory bolt. And we'll tighten that up with an 18mm wrench and socket. We'll do the same thing for the other side. Once you have that shock in and tightened down, the next thing we're going to do is put that fender liner back in. So reinstall those 3 screws and then we'll tighten them up with an 8mm. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Next, we're going to reinstall these brake line brackets on the axle. Let's get those bolts in. We're going to use a 13mm to tighten them up. Same thing for the other side. So next thing we're going to do is install this brand new sway bar end links from SkyJacker. Now SkyJacker provides us with brand new hardware for the top mount. We're going to reuse the factory bolt for the bottom. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. Now these do have a little bit of a bend to them, so we want to make that bend face outward away from the Jeep. We're going to take this black button head bolt that they give us with an Allen head, and we're going to place a flat washer on there. We're going to go from the outside of the vehicle towards the inside. And then on the very inside, we're gonna get a flat washer and a nylon lock nut. So once you got that in, we're gonna use a 3/4 inch wrench for the nut and a 5/16 Allen for the bolt head. I'm gonna tighten that up. Like I said, for the bottom, we're reusing that factory hardware. So we're gonna insert our bolt from behind the shock, out through the link, and then install that nut. After that's in, we're gonna use an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket to tighten that up. We're gonna do the same thing for the other side. Next, we're gonna put our diff hose back on, so we're gonna squeeze that clamp open again. So the last step on the reassembly of the rear, of course, is to get that track bar back in. Now we can put all of the wheels and tires back on, set the vehicle on the ground, and use the weight to help us line that hole up. There's also another way that you can do this. If you have the vehicle up in the air, you can use a rather large ratchet strap. Now, if you are gonna use a ratchet strap, I recommend using extra precaution, considering that you have the vehicle up in the air. Now we're gonna use this large ratchet strap to pull the axle over so we can line that hole up, and I'm gonna show you how to do that right now. So we're gonna hook into this bracket here with this nice little hole in it. So you're just gonna ratchet it over in small amounts till you get that hole to line up, and then we're gonna reinstall that factory bolt. When you get the bolt through, we're gonna place that nut back on there, and we're gonna use a 21mm socket and wrench to tighten that up. After that, you can remove your ratchet strap. So now that the Jeep's on the ground, you can see that our track bar actually lines up with that bolt hole. So we're gonna reinstall that factory bolt, pushing that all the way through to the back side. And we're gonna put our nut on, and then we'll tighten it up with a 21mm socket and wrench. So after you get those track bars reinstalled and you have all that hardware tightened up, you want to put your wheels back on and tighten them down with that 22mm, torquing them to factory specs. Also, you'll want to go get an alignment since we messed with the suspension. However, that's going to wrap up my review and install. For more videos like this, check us out at ExtremeTerrain.com.